We are often asked, how much control does the state really have over its spending? For example, aren't there a lot of factors that tend to constrain the legislature, such as voter-approved measures? Well, in fact, there are many constraints on state spending. For example, the state constitution has many requirements that limit what the state can do. For example, the gas taxes that people pay can only be spent and used for transportation purposes. The state also has a lot of contractual obligations. For example, when it makes commitments to certain pension benefits, those require a level of spending that's almost impossible to change. The state has many programs that are funded jointly by the federal government and the state. And as a result, the federal government places a lot of restrictions on the whole program area that can limit the legislature's discretion. And finally, the courts, either a state court or a federal court, can intervene and take action which prevents the legislature from achieving savings, say in a bad budget year, through actions that they've taken to control program spending. Let's take a look at the state's general fund spending and examine just how much control does the legislature have over program spending in those areas. About 1/10 of the state's general fund budget is spent on debt service on various bonds that we issue for infrastructure purposes, and to pay for retirement-related obligations, such as pensions and retiree health. The state has virtually no control over this spending in the near term because of these obligations that take many, many years to retire. About 40% of the state's budget is spent on what we call K-14 education, preschool, elementary, high school, and community colleges. Now, some would argue that the state has very little control over that big block of general fund spending. And this is because of a voter-approved measure, Proposition 98, that was passed by the voters back in 1988, that sets a minimum level of spending that the state has to provide each year. However, the state can go above that minimum guarantee, or it can go with a 2/3 vote of the legislature below that level of spending. I think it's also important to note that even within Proposition 98, it has an automatic mechanism that can help the legislature control costs during difficult budgetary years because the minimum guarantee goes down lower than it otherwise would be. Finally, and most importantly about K-14 school spending, regardless of the overall amount that the state is required to spend, the legislature has total control over the spending within that total amount. The Medi-Cal program, which provides health care services to low-income people, comprises about 1/6 of the state's budget. Now, this is one of those programs that is jointly funded by the federal government and the state. So there are constraints on the legislature's ability to make various changes to the program because of federal requirements. Still, the legislature has control over several program elements, from changing eligibility to changing the method of service delivery, selection of optional benefits. So it still has some control. There are many other health and social services programs that are like Medi-Cal. They're jointly funded by the federal and state governments. And so there are constraints on what the legislature can do in many situations. But the legislature still has control over many aspects of those programs. About 1/10 of the state's budget is spent on the state prison system. This is an area where the legislature has considerable control over spending. For example, it can make changes to sentencing, which affects cost in the future. However, typically those are only done for new felons, and therefore it doesn't affect those already in prison. In addition, the federal courts have taken over health care cost in the state's prison, and we have virtually no control over that area. Finally, the state spends about 1/8 of its entire general fund budget on either college-related expenses or on our court system. The colleges would include our universities, the community colleges, financial aid, etc. Now, the legislature has a lot of control over spending on these two program areas. It can change service levels, for example, how many kids go to college. And in addition, both of these program areas have sources other than the general fund that are used to support them, for example, tuition or fines and penalties. So this is an area where the legislature does have a lot of control and discretion each year. So in conclusion, there clearly are a lot of constraints that limit the legislature's ability in passing a budget each year. A lot of these are sort of external to the legislature: courts, the federal government, voter-approved initiatives. Still, it's important to understand that in the long run, the legislature has complete control over its budget. And even in the near term, it still exerts considerable discretion over its spending.